5, 4, 3.
Hi there, I'm Dave Harris, Course Director for Show Production Systems, and here we have a Leslie Model 120, very similar to the famous Leslie 122, and the shorter version, the 142, also similar to the taller 147 and its counterpart, the 145, the shorter 145. Don Leslie invented the spinning speaker here in 1941 to match up to the Hammond organ, which was gaining popularity in the 30s. The Hammond B3 became very popular by the mid-50s and mid-60s, which has a built-in preamp that feeds a Leslie normally. So a Leslie is just a tube amplifier sending signal into two different speakers, a high speaker and a low speaker, a tweeter and a woofer, which at first were stationary, and Hammond's first tone cabinets were stationary speakers. But here we have the Leslie spinning speaker, which uses a moving rotor on the top and the bottom. You heard me playing that earlier. But to start here with a short demo, the organ, the Hammond organ, sounded very stationary for a long time. They had their own tone cabinets with stationary speakers. They even had some models of the Hammond that had speakers below the actual organ by the player's feet. This wasn't adequate over time, and players found the liking of the Leslie speaker, which Don Leslie invented, to be the pipe voice of the organ, or emulate a pipe organ. So in some ways, you may ask yourself, why would I want speakers to be shooting into horns that are constantly moving? Because this isn't exactly an audiophile's dream for a speaker system, but in pairing it up to the Hammond organ, or at least the organ sound from this Nord keyboard, it creates this sloshing around of sound, and the ramping up and ramping down of speed is actually something that's been brought into music culture for well over 50 years. So when we look at the inner workings of a Leslie speaker, we see a tube amplifier that hooks up to a Hammond organ usually, which then sends power to two different motors, a low motor and a high motor. And the first Leslies that came out only had a one-speed motor. So when you would turn the motors on, it would spin these top and lower rotors fast, and then it would shut off. There were two speeds. There was fast and off, or just on and off. At some point towards the 50s and 60s, when the Hammond and Leslie became very popular in the early 1960s, they added the two-speed motor, the dual stack motor. So this has a fast speed and a slower motor for slow speeds. Same with that top rotor. And actually, when these Leslies first came out, they didn't even have the top tweeter. They just had a lower rotor, and it just did fast and off. Now we have a tweeter and a woofer. And in order to have that, we take a look at the wiring diagram. We see that it not only has a tube amp, but it feeds a crossover circuit, which you can actually see in this Leslie in the back there. If we can zoom in the back, it might be a little hard to see there, but we see it in the diagram as well. There's a crossover splitting frequencies at about 800 hertz up to the highs and down to the low woofer. Besides that, it's all mixing and matching sounds from the organ, from the drawbars of the organ. And stay tuned, because I very well might do a demo on the Hammond organ, which could be its own demo in and of itself. But as we look into the signal flow, you'd be reminded from show production class, from SPS, that the live audio signal flow involves a mic plugging into a preamp and a mixer, hitting a signal processor, and then amplifiers for loudspeakers. Each of these levels in our signal flow have a different voltage associated with it. Mic levels, typically a lower voltage in the millivolt range. Line levels, about 1.23 volts for professional audio. And loudspeaker level is approximately 100 volts. So a Hammond organ has a preamp in it, just like a mixer. But a Hammond organ's preamp puts out about 10 volts of signal. That is 10 times the voltage of a professional audio mixer. So you either need to use a Hammond organ to drive a Leslie, or you need to use a preamp pedal before you would drive a Leslie. So unlike a guitar amplifier, typical guitar amplifier actually has a preamp built in. You're plugging into a preamp with your guitar, and it's feeding the power amp and speaker built into this guitar amplifier. The older Leslies, this tall Leslie here, you can see on the bottom left there's a 6-pin or a 6-prong cable connection that is usually found on Leslies. This one next to me has a custom amplifier where it's broken apart and doesn't have that 6-pin connection. But the typical 6-pin connection comes from the Hammond organ, and it carries power on 2 pins, signal on another 2 pins, and switching of speeds on the last 2 pins. So that's 6 pins, 2 pins for power, 2 pins for signal, and 2 pins for speed switching, which was usually done via this half-moon switch on a Hammond organ. A lot of people nowadays use a foot pedal. That's what I was using here. So I have a custom amplifier in this Leslie here, which we've built the preamp circuit into it with a little tube so that we could actually plug a keyboard or a guitar directly into the preamp and amplifier. So it's sort of like a guitar amp where it has both sections built into it. In addition to breaking apart that 6-pin, I've added an IEC for power and a switch to turn it on, and a separate 1/4 inch for the speed switch. So now this could be used as a standalone device. So you might see that if you're out on tour with a certain group. You very well might see a Hammond organ that is paired up with a Leslie, and they do use that 6-pin cable only. So you might encounter that in the wild as well. Again, in that case, you cannot just plug a guitar directly into the Leslie. You need to preamp it first. You need it to be at least like 7 to 10 volts. So there were newer Leslies created that didn't look as nice. They weren't in open wooden cabinets. They were in covered wood or MDF particle board cabinets. Still an open baffle at the bottom, but this particular Leslie here, you're seeing the preamp pedal for it. So you could plug another keyboard or guitar right into that pedal, which gets powered up into the wall, and that sends power switching with those stomp switches and signal into the Leslie. They sell modern Leslies. Again, they try to stay away from the older wooden look, but they do make newer Leslies that are entirely wood as well. Price range of about $2,500, or you could buy an older one and fix it up for approximately that amount as well. So the Leslie 3300 is a product they still sell. And then you might be familiar with plugins and any typical DAW. You can buy some of these plugins. They also come with some called Rotosonic. There was another brand called Rotosonic that was copying Leslie. So you might see a rotary ensemble or a different type of plugin where they give you all of the different types of effects or parameter adjustments that you could normally make, or even placement of microphones. As we'll get into a short demo here if we have time to demonstrate placement of mics. And we have the back open here. We have the wooden baffle off, just so we can see the motors, we can see the mechanisms, we can see the woofer and the tweeter, the crossover. But usually the back would be closed up. It would be a sealed cabinet, which would provide more low-end response. So we're going to seal it up after this and see if we can get a little bit more low-end out of it. But that is the basics of the cabinet itself, the signal flow, a little bit of interfacing. And you might see some other plugins where they actually model the exact amplifier itself down to the tubes. You'll even see them lighting up more when you actually drive it. Of course, this is called Amplitube, and this is a modeler. But you actually see the color of AC power cables and the sticker telling you that the white cables went to the slower motors, and the brown cable went to the fast motors. So this is set up a little bit differently with only one black and one white, but they split into each motor. And when I hit this speed switch, we are sending signal to a relay to flip the fast motors on or switch that over to the slow motors. And again, that created the famous whirl of sound. Versus where Hammonds came from, this stopped speed or stationary sound, which, looking back in hindsight, is a little bit boring to many people's taste nowadays. Cool, so I think we're about ready to get into a little demo here. Any questions before I do that? We'll save that for after this. So, most Leslies you deal with won't have the stop function. Many of them, it's only slow and it's fast or slow, and that's it. Now there are several modifications where you put a different type of relay in here and it adds the brake function. Back in the 70s and 80s, people started doing this in Memphis, so they call this the Memphis mod by adding that brake. So to actually stop the Leslie. And to be able to go from stop stationary mode directly into fast mode, it replicates the older Leslies that only had stop and fast. And this particular model is called a 120. I'm going to go back in the slideshow here a little bit to what would be a 147. That is the taller 147. There's a shorter 145. 147 and 145 take an unbalanced signal. They had a pedal that you would plug in a guitar, a Wurlitzer, a piano, electric piano, and you could drive these organs. There's a 122 and 142 that look exactly the same, slightly different amplifier, but those were meant for a balanced signal, as we learned about, and the Hammond organ puts out a balanced signal. High, low, and ground. If you don't have a Hammond organ, you can't use the 122 or 142, and those are the most famous Leslies. You need an interface pedal to go from unbalanced keyboard, guitar, to balanced. So that's effectively what this built-in preamp is doing in here. A lot of Leslies you see as well won't have lights. Might be a little hard to see that here, but I've modded some lights into this, which you may see or you might not. But usually when you run into these, it's a Leslie paired up with a Hammond organ. To talk a little bit more about these, the Hammond B3 model came out in 1955. There was no ground in electrical outlets. That wasn't popularized yet. So this is not a grounded instrument, and it sends just hot and neutral power to the Leslie, which is again not a grounded instrument. So you'd have this Hammond organ and Leslie that are not grounded. They're what we refer to as a floating ground system, which isn't dangerous in and of itself, but when you combine it with other systems that are grounded electrically to an outlet, it becomes an issue. Now, when we're touring around with older Hammonds, which are common to be toured around with, they've gone in and electrically grounded them now. Effectively, what we've done here with this Leslie, there's an IEC D plug, we call them here. IEC power cord. That does have a ground, and it is wired to this chassis. So this is now a grounded, up-to-date amplifier in this particular Leslie. Another note, Lawrence Hammond, who created the tone wheel generator, they became very popular. He had his own tone wheel cabinets, I mentioned. They did not spin. He did not like this idea at all. He did not like Don Leslie personally, and he did not like this speaker. He tried very hard to not have the Leslie become the speaker for the Hammond, to the point where he refused to sell them at his stores. By the 1960s, early 60s, the Leslie sound became so popular with gospel and jazz that people demanded to buy a Leslie with a Hammond, and they went so far as to change the pinout of their Hammond so that it couldn't work with a Leslie. Don Leslie invented a different type of connector that could then work with it. There were certain Leslies called 22Hs for Hammond, or 22W, or it was one called 44W, which was meant for a Wurlitzer or any general unbalanced input. So Don Leslie was always working around Hammond to try to be able to still deliver his product, which became so popular that oftentimes when you see a Hammond B3 with the pedals and the bench, it'd be very rare to not see the Leslie paired up with it. They are kind of one and the same. 1965, CBS bought Fender, very big company. You're probably aware of the Fender amplifier I'd shown before. Or the, here's a Fender Twin. So Fender company was bought by CBS. CBS also bought Leslie at the same time. So CBS, the broadcasting service company, actually owned Leslie for a period, and they became very popular, but they were, at that point, starting to mass produce the wooden Leslies and go into their Pro solid state or Pro line series. At this point, Leslie was sold to Hammond Suzuki in 1980, and that's who owns them now, is Hammond Suzuki. So while they still make Leslies, newer modern Leslies, it is the older ones that are sought after. Again, this is a Model 120. So this used to not have this top rotor at all. It just had a lower, and it was completely covered here. And it had a 2-speed, so it could do fast and slow. But a lot of older ones were just the woofer, and they were just the 1-speed, fast or off. So for this one, we've modded in this shelf, put in this rotor. So this is effectively the exact same thing as a large 122 type Leslie. But those were at least double the size. And in the neighborhood of 175 pounds we're looking at, which does take 2 people, at least a dolly. You can do it with 1 person in a dolly. This cut down on the size by about half, but unfortunately, because of the woofer, these motors, and the tube amplifier, it didn't really cut down on the weight so much, so this still weighs about 125 pounds. So if you're dealing with Leslies, they weigh quite a bit. When you're dealing with their counterpart, these have a special dolly system specifically for them. This is about 400 pounds. So a lot of people do what's called a Hammond chop. They chop off the legs, they take out the inner guts, and they actually mod this into a smaller case and make it more portable. But that is the Hammond and Leslie. I think that's about it. I think we're about ready to cover up the back. So let me get to that. And while I do that, we'll just take a quick pause, and we'll come back with a quick demo of audio. Okay. Not going to make this too lengthy. I'm going to try to do something similar that I did before to try to just hear the A-B between them. But right away we notice quite a bit more low end when the box is actually sealed up. Now, you'll also encounter Leslie's that have built-in microphones. Some people will mount microphones inside and even put XLR ports right inside the wood and try to keep it sealed up. But to have that kind of roll right into a gig and be able to be easily interfaced. Sometimes on tour as well, you'll see a larger Leslie inside of a Rode case with the mics built into the case or the Leslie, and they even just keep the case shut the whole time. They have XLR ports coming right out of the case. Sometimes they just crack the case open a little bit. Sometimes the Leslie stays backstage in a quieter location. Or you go back towards the 70s and 80s, like the Grateful Dead had 10 Leslies spread around stage so that everybody could hear it. Or they would double stack. Allman Brothers used to double stack Leslies to get more of a bass effect or try to get the woofer to be ear height by double stacking them. And again, you add maybe some cool lighting effects. And this one right here is flashing to the sound. So when things start spinning up, and you can hear how much that slow speed really pulls some emotion out into the music. When it used to just be fast and off, which does sound very cool, and you're hearing the low take a little bit longer to slow down, that low rotor. But one thing to mention here, as I go back to the very first slide, it'll let me. You have a tweeter firing into a horn on the top. A 2-speed horn and a 2-speed drum rotor. Something to note here is that the audio for the tweeter is shooting out of one of these sides of the horn. The other side is completely blocked off. So it's just there for a counterweight, so it spins at the same rate, or it spins evenly. So when you stop this organ, right now it's shooting out the highs in some random direction. And I can't tell if it's the left one or the right one. So there's some differing to the sound based on just where it stops. And that's going to change the sound every single time. As far as an audiophile, from a live sound perspective, to be moving your tweeter in comparison to your woofer is a bad idea. They are out of time, out of phase. There's shifts and crossover issues. Just based on the timing and where you're spreading that around, but from the sound of the Hammond organ or the sonic quality of what we're trying to go for with this instrument, it's really part of the instrument. We don't really care if there's small cancellations, because that's actually what we're hearing. We're hearing a differing of pitch, and we're hearing a differing of amplitude. And that's what creates that famous warble. Now, you'll also see some settings inside of a DAW plugin. And a DAW plugin will let you usually change the placement of microphones. See if this one has it visible. Or we'll go back and see if this one does. Okay, you're not actually seeing the parameters here, but what you're seeing is the type of Leslie on the far right, 122 versus the newer 122As. 147 is the unbalanced version, 3300 is the newer one, and there's another one called a Studio 12. Other options they'll give you are the types of microphones. If the back is open or closed, you could see this one looks like it's an open back they're going for. And also the distance of the microphones and spread of the microphones. And they've actually modeled all of those settings with actual microphones into some of these plugins so that you can actually mimic the distance. Capturing more air. We'll see if this works here. Hard for me to tell off the cuff just by moving it really quickly, but I'm sure that did change the sound a bit. Angling them differently, panning them differently. Some people try to just pan, they'll just do one top and one bottom and maybe pan top to the left and bottom to the right in a PA. There's different miking techniques that I encourage you to look up and look at other people talking about the Leslie and how they use it with really all popular music. Based on the drawbars you can pull out on this Hammond organ, there's something like 8 million different sounds it can create, and I firmly believe that is why the Hammond organ is still being used in popular music of every single genre almost 100 years after being created, and we'll still see that moving forward. So again, whether you're using the emulation or the real thing, as far as me personally and a lot of keyboardists, we feel that you can't reproduce the moving of air that accurately without actually moving air, swirling around this sound. But the Nord does a decent Leslie. There are pedals called the Neo Ventilator. There are these plugins that actually do a pretty good job nowadays. So I think that's it. The Dawn Leslie. Again, this was a model 120, a little bit more rare and customized to be like a mini 122, but you'll commonly see the 122 and 142, the 147 and 145 paired up, usually with a Hammond B3. Most iconic sound of glory in rock and roll. At least that's how Rolling Stone magazine advertised the Hammond organ. So at this point, if we have any Q&A, no, we don't have much of a crowd today at this last minute put together, but might also redo this later or try to edit this and see what we have.
Could you give us another organ sound from your Nord?
Say that one more time.
Could you give us another organ sound from your Nord?
Another organ sound?
Maybe one with more bass?
Of course, manipulating the Hammond organ is half of the battle with this. This is a Leslie demo, but easily could be a Hammond organ demo, and changing the relationship of the higher sounding drawbars and hearing more of the tweeter moving around. That definitely can change the characteristics as well, very much so. Any other questions?
Hi, yes. I'm John from Orlando.
John, yeah.
How you doing? So where did you get the tiny models?
That's a great question. I know there's actually several people making 3D printed models of everything on Etsy and different websites. I think there are a couple people making these. This is 3D printed though. I can show you after this, or if you can take a close-up, you can actually see the etched lines. And they did a really good job with the removable parts. Can actually teach from it as well and show the inner workings of the tone the tone generator, which you actually start with a big gear and a start motor that cranks it up, big steel tone bar with these gears on it called tone wheels. This was a gift from the holidays last year, so I can't tell you exactly where it came from, but you can look these up, and I'm sure they're very easy to find. I actually got a few of them, some other electric pianos as well, but the Leslie's very cool too, and they're all moving parts. So the rotors actually spin, the horn spins, no belts or anything, but pretty cool. And there's an older, the crossover is usually in this little wooden, it's actually wood and cardboard, but it's usually under there behind the lower motor. So this one's been customized a little bit. I play slightly smaller gigs. I'm not on an arena tour as a keyboardist, so this is something I can put in the back of my car. It's 125 pounds, but the size of it makes it so I can still fit it in my car and take it around, which is hard to do. They do have a Pro line model. The 825 is pretty short. There's an 860 that's even slightly smaller than this. So they actually did make a very small model. It just doesn't look as cool because it's not wood. So when you want the actual wooden look, you have to do it yourself. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll do this again. Thanks a lot.